There's nothing quite like Texas barbecue. The scent of hickory and mesquite smoke hangs thick in the air, wrapping around you like a warm embrace. The sizzle of brisket hitting the grill, the low hum of country music from an old radio, the murmur of satisfied customers. It's a scene as familiar as it is mouth-watering. And if you ever found yourself driving down Highway 281 late at night, you might have noticed a flickering red neon sign glowing against a dark Texas sky. Duval's Smokehouse. Just a simple roadside food truck. But to those who knew it, it was legendary. The kind of place where people would drive for miles just to sink their teeth into ribs, so tender they fell off the bone. But there was something else in the air, too, something no one noticed. Duval's wasn't just a barbecue joint. It was an institution. The kind of place that turned first-time visitors into lifelong customers. A small rustic food truck parked just off the highway, with smoke curling up into the night, drawing in weary travelers and hungry locals like moths to a flame. The man behind the grill, Samuel Duval, had a reputation for his craft. He never shared his recipes, never let anyone too close to his operation. But no one questioned it because the food, it was that good. People came for the brisket, the ribs, the house-made sausage. They left raving about the flavor, the texture, the way it melted in their mouths. Some even swore it was the best barbecue they'd ever had. But what they didn't know, what no one suspected, was that something far darker was cooking behind the scenes. Because hidden beneath the layers of mesquite smoke and slow-cooked perfection was a secret that would turn stomachs, not satisfy them. And once the truth came out, Duval's Smokehouse would be known for something else entirely. What if I told you the best barbecue in Texas had a secret ingredient? They say every great chef has a secret ingredient, something that sets them apart, an edge, a trick of the trade. Charles never thought he'd find this by accident. It started on a cold night, in an alley behind the restaurant. A man slumped against a dumpster, clutching his stomach. His breath was ragged, shallow. Then, suddenly, nothing. Silence. Charles stood there for a long time. He should have walked away, called someone, but instead, he looked down at the body and he hesitated. Hunger does strange things to a man, and Charles was so hungry. One cut, that's all it took. One slice, so clean, so precise, like carving a prime cut of beef. The muscle peeled away like any other, no different than pork or lamb. And when it hit the pan, sizzling in butter and garlic, it smelled mouth-watering. He told himself it was just a taste, just a curiosity, a bite. But as soon as it touched his tongue, something inside him changed. It was perfect. The texture, the richness, the way the fat melted, coating his mouth like the finest wagyu. He sat there in the dim light of his kitchen, chewing slowly, savoring the flavor. His mind raced. His heart pounded. He expected to feel sick. He didn't. The next night, he brought the dish to the restaurant. He made just one plate, served it to one customer, watched as they took their first bite. Their eyes widened, a slow, approving nod, a smile, then another bite, and another. That was the moment he knew. He had stumbled onto something truly special. But where could he find more? The city was full of forgotten people, shadows who drifted between alleys, who slept under flickering streetlights, people no one would miss, people who could disappear without a trace. It became a pattern, a routine, a system, a cut here, a slice there, the right balance of fat and muscle, aged just long enough, seasoned to perfection, served with the finest wine. They loved it. They craved it. They begged for more. And Charles? He was happy to provide. Down in the basement, beneath the restaurant, his work continued. The room was cold, sterile, efficient. Hooks lined the walls. A drain in the floor. A butcher's table, gleaming under fluorescent light. Precision, that was the key. No waste, no mistakes. Every part had a purpose. The bones for broth, the fat for rendering. The flesh, well, that was a masterpiece. It wasn't just food anymore. It was art. And the people, they kept eating, kept complimenting the depth of flavor, the tenderness, the uniqueness of it. The restaurant's reputation soared. His secret was safe, until one night, a detective sat at the bar, ordered the special, ate in silence. Then, when the plate was clean, he leaned forward and asked one question. "Tell me, chef, where do you source your meat?" Charles smiled. He always knew the last meal would be his own. Amanda never considered herself paranoid. She prided herself on being thorough, meticulous, the kind of person who always had her facts straight before jumping to conclusions. But lately, something wasn't right. It started with a missing supply order. Nothing major. Just a few cartons of eggs and a crate of fresh vegetables that never arrived. The supplier swore it had been delivered, and yet there was no record of it in the inventory. She brushed it off as a clerical error. Maybe a miscommunication between the kitchen staff and the delivery driver. But then it happened again, and again. At first, Amanda chalked it up to normal restaurant chaos. Mistakes happened. Orders got misplaced. But the numbers in the ledger, they didn't make sense. She spent hours going over them in the small office behind the kitchen, red pen in hand, circling discrepancies that seemed to multiply the deeper she looked. Pounds of meat that were never cooked. Boxes of produce that never made it to the shelves. Expenses that had no corresponding receipts. And then there were the deliveries. Trucks arriving at odd hours, dropping off supplies that no one logged. She asked the other employees, but no one seemed to know anything. Or if they did, they were too afraid to say. Then, one night, long after closing, Amanda found herself alone in the restaurant. The dim glow of the emergency exit signs cast eerie shadows along the tile floor. The air was thick with the scent of garlic and something else, something metallic, something faintly sour. She followed the smell, past the silent kitchen stations, past the empty dining room, until she reached the back storage area. There, against the far wall, was the walk-in freezer. It hummed softly, the only sound in the otherwise still room. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle. She didn't know why. It was just a freezer. She'd opened it 1,000 times before. The door creaked as it swung open. Cold air rushed past her, biting at her skin. Inside, shelves were lined with frozen meats, neatly wrapped in butcher paper. But something was off. A crate in the corner wasn't sealed properly. The lid was slightly askew. Amanda hesitated, her breath shallow. She took a step. Narrator, low, deliberate tone. The alley behind Charles's smokehouse and grill was a place most people ignored. Overflowing dumpsters, the stench of rot, just another forgotten corner of the city. But for one man, it was a lifeline. The homeless man, known only as Eddie, shuffled through the garbage with the slow, practiced movements of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. His fingers, callous and grimy, sifted through discarded scraps, greasy paper, and half-eaten meals. His stomach gnawed at him, always hungry, always desperate. Then his fingers hit something solid. At first, he thought it was a chicken bone, tossed carelessly from a plate. But as he lifted it, turning it over in the dim light, something twisted in his gut. It was too large, too smooth in places and too jagged in others. His breath caught. He brought it closer to his face, squinting through the grime. The bone was snapped at the end. Hollow, not chicken, not pork, something else. Eddie dropped it like it burned him, stumbling back against the dumpster. His breath came fast now, heart-hammering. He had seen things before, things people threw away, things they shouldn't have. But this was different. He backed away, nearly tripping over his own feet, and bolted down the alley. That was when he saw the patrol car idling at the curb. The call crackled over the radio. Dispatch barely able to mask the tension in their voice. Possible human remains. Unit 14 respond. The first officer on the scene, Officer Daniels, had been on the force for nearly a decade. He had seen his fair share of gruesome sights, but the moment he stepped into that alley, something felt wrong. The smell, the heaviness in the air. His partner, Officer Ruiz, was already pulling on gloves, crouching beside the dumpster where Eddie had found the bone. Daniels lifted it carefully. The streetlights cast a pale glow over it. His stomach turned. This isn't right. He pulled out his radio. We need a forensic team down here. Now! Minutes passed. Then the sirens began. Blue and red lights slashed through the dark. The alley, once ignored, was now alive with movement. More officers arrived. A forensic team. A detective. Crime scene tape stretched across the entrance. The city's usual background hum. The distant honk of traffic. The murmur of late-night pedestrians. Faded into something quieter. Something heavier. Then came the search. They started with the dumpsters. The first few bags yielded nothing but rotting food and discarded napkins. But then, a black plastic bag, tied too tight, too carefully. The kind of bag that wasn't meant to be found. The forensic technician pulled the knot loose, peeling the plastic away. The smell hit first. Something deeper than rot. Something that made seasoned officers turn away, pressing their sleeves to their faces. Inside, beneath layers of grease-soaked rags, were remains. Flesh, marbled with fat, severed cleanly at the joints. No signs of decay, fresh. Silence fell over the team. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, a frantic voice in the back door of the restaurant. "We've got more." Inside Charles's smokehouse and grill, the horror continued to unfold. In the walk-in freezer, forensic teams uncovered severed limbs, meticulously wrapped in butcher paper. Labeled. The kitchen was a grotesque crime scene disguised as a place of business. Knives, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. A meat grinder, clogged with something that wasn't beef. Bloodstains that had been scrubbed, but never completely erased. And then, the realization that sent a chill through every single person in that building. The freezer inventory, neatly listed in Charles's own handwriting, didn't match the restaurant's usual orders. There were names, not cuts of beef, not portions of pork ribs. Names. The forensic team worked methodically, collecting samples, cataloging every grotesque detail. DNA testing would take time, but the detectives already knew. The missing people, the faces on flyers scattered across the city. They had been here. And the customers? The thought was too much to bear. They had been eating them. Outside, Detective Harrison Graves stood in the flashing lights, a cigarette burning between his fingers. He had seen evil before, but nothing like this. Ruiz approached him, his face pale, his voice unsteady. It was never just barbecue, was it? Graves exhaled, watching the smoke curl into the night. No. Inside the restaurant, the horror of Charles's crimes lay bare, piece by horrifying piece. And yet, one question remained. Where was Charles? He was nowhere to be found. The moment Charles was caught, he didn't fight. He didn't run. He didn't even flinch. When the officers stormed his apartment, weapons drawn, barking commands, he simply sat at his kitchen table, a half-empty glass of wine in his hand. He looked up at them with an almost amused expression, as if he had been expecting company, as if the entire thing was nothing more than an inconvenience. He raised his hands in surrender, but there was no fear in his eyes, no regret, no desperation, just that same eerie calm. The officers who took him into custody would later say that they had never arrested anyone like him. No shaking hands, no frantic questions, no tears. Even as they listed the charges, murder, mutilation, desecration of a human body, Charles only smiled, a slight curve of the lips, as if he knew something they didn't. And, in a way, he did. The moment his mugshot was released, the case exploded. The media latched on like vultures to a fresh corpse. Headlines screamed his name. Talk shows dissected every detail of his life. What kind of man could do this? Was he insane? Evil? Or something else entirely? The public was outraged. Protests lined the courthouse steps, demanding justice for the families of the missing, the people whose loved ones had vanished, only to be found in the most horrific of circumstances. Or worse, never found at all. And yet, Charles remained silent. No confessions, no explanations, just a cold, unwavering stare every time he was let in and out of the courtroom. The trial itself was a spectacle. The prosecution painted him as a monster, a predator who had manipulated, deceived, and slaughtered without remorse. They detailed the gruesome discoveries made in his apartment. The meticulously labeled bags, the sinister journal entries, the bones. But it was the defense that chilled the room. They didn't argue innocence. They didn't plead insanity. Instead, they leaned into the mystery. They posed a question. Do you really know what you've eaten? The moment sent a shudder through the courtroom. And then came the moment no one would ever forget. Charles was asked if he had anything to say before sentencing. For the first time in the entire trial, he leaned forward, gripping the wooden stand as he looked directly into the eyes of the courtroom. A slow smile spread across his lips as he said 5 words. You already ate her. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, screams, a woman in the gallery fainted. The judge slammed the gavel, demanding order. But the damage was done, because suddenly, it wasn't just about the murders. It wasn't just about the bodies. It was about what had been done with them. The verdict was swift. Life without the possibility of parole. A sentence meant to lock him away forever, to ensure he would never see freedom again. But the horror didn't end there, because even after Charles was locked away, whispers continued, about restaurants he frequented, about missing persons cases that remained unsolved, about a supply chain of meat that suddenly seemed far less reliable, and about the people who had unknowingly dined with death itself. Because if Charles was telling the truth, then some monsters don't just kill, they feed. Duval's Smokehouse was once the pride of the small town, a place where families gathered, where road-tripping foodies made detours just to get a taste of that legendary barbecue. The secret sauce, the perfectly smoked meat. It was a recipe people swore by. But when the truth came out, that admiration curdled into something else entirely. The restaurant shut down almost overnight, its doors chained, its windows boarded up. No one wanted to be associated with what had happened there. No one wanted to remember. But places like Duval's, they don't just disappear. People still talk about it. A new family moves into town, and someone always brings it up a little too casually. Oh, that building? Yeah, that used to be Duval's. Until they found out what was in the meat. They say like an old wives' tale, like it's something distant, something safely in the past. But the unease in their voices tells a different story. Tourists still visit the site, even though the lot has sat empty for years. Some are drawn by morbid curiosity. Others, those who claim to be sensitive to things beyond the living, say the place isn't as empty as it looks. They talk about the smell, a faint trace of smoked meat in the air, long after the last fire in that pit was snuffed out. They mention the whispers, low, unintelligible voices that drift on the wind when you stand too close to the abandoned lot. And sometimes, they swear they hear the scrape of a knife against a wooden block, the rhythmic chop of something being prepared. But there's no one there. Local businesses don't like to acknowledge the place. Some believe talking about it is bad luck. Others just don't want to scare off customers. But every now and then, someone slips. A long-time resident, after a drink or two, might tell a little too much about how, even before the truth came out, there were rumors, missing drifters, strange deliveries at odd hours, bones in the alleyway out back. Things people ignored until they couldn't anymore. And the most unsettling part? The legacy of Duval's Smokehouse isn't just a cautionary tale. It's a question. A question no one really wants to answer. Because if one man could do this, if an entire town could eat there week after week without ever suspecting a thing, how many more like him are out there? And the next time you bite into a meal, are you sure you know what's on your plate? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime and horror stories. Until next time, stay safe and watch what you eat.